Good evening, everybody. God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of the trumpet. This is the second installment of our newest iteration of Orthodoxy 101. I do this class about every year, and so if you're looking back through the videos, you'll see a lot of classes with these labels in order. And I dare say, if one were to go through and actually watch them, not that I'm recommending that, but you would also find that a lot of the content overlaps. But this time I am doing something a little bit different, or emphasizing a particular dimension of it, or at least I was last time, that I hadn't focused on before. And so, to recap, we talked about the fact that Genesis comes into existence already in theological and polemical dialogue with the Mesopotamian religions of the world around it. It borrows certain imagery from those religions, but deploys it in new ways that is intended to give a very different answer to the questions of who is God and what is a human being, what's the purpose of human life, and things like that. So the creation story, the story of the creation of the days, the story of the creation of Adam and Eve, the garden, all of this is imagery that on some level would be very familiar to any ancient Mesopotamian person, Akkadian or whatever, but used in a way that is meant to give a very different picture of things. So, for instance, as I said last time, the creation of the world is deliberate and intentional. The creation of human beings is extremely deliberate. It's actually deliberative. Let us make thought put into it. And there, the Garden of Eden is a mountaintop garden which is intended to be a temple. Like the ziggurat temples, which are intended to represent mountains of the other religions, but the difference is that instead of the garden or the temple being made by the people going up and the God being fashioned out of the ground and carved into an idol and put there, it's reversed. God makes the mountain, puts his garden on top of it, and then fashions the man out of the earth and puts him there, and then gives him the task of guarding the sanctity of the place, naming the animals in it, and being his priest there, and gives the woman as his helper, both as a companion for him and as one to help him in the task of serving God in this way. The woman is deceived, tricked, and Adam, rather than putting a stop to it, goes along with it, thereby abdicating his responsibility, and they lose the glory that they were robed with, the divine life they were robed with, and they gain the knowledge of good and evil untimely. They were young, inexperienced, unwise, not prepared for that kind of knowledge, but now they have this knowledge, but not experience or wisdom, and now no longer the grace of God. They become creatures of the body, clothed, robed, rather than the divine glory of God, robed in garments of skin, defined by their senses and their biological experience of the world, cast out of the garden then, and we see then, in the very next iteration of their liturgical life, Cain and Abel, murder enters into the scene. So now I want to skip ahead just a little bit. The problem between Cain and Abel presages a larger troubling. It says that God looked down upon the world and it was full of wickedness, that humans everywhere were bent toward evil, and he sees that Noah is righteous. And he calls to Noah and he says, Noah, you have been found righteous in my sight, and I want you to build an ark for me and bring in living things because I'm going to flood the earth with water. Notice here, first of all, that you have a transgression by man that's acknowledged. It says it here at the beginning of the Lord God said, my spirit will not remain with these people forever, for they are flesh. Their days are 120 years. They were giants. The Lord saw that man's wickedness was great in the earth. Every intent of the thoughts within his heart was only evil continually. So there's a transgression in the sense of turning toward evil now. And this brings about a situation in which the boundaries of the created order begin to fragment as well. There is a breaking up of the order of the created world. God put the waters in the seas and above the firmament, it says. And now you're going to see that God is saying these things are going to crack open. The boundaries are going to break. And there's going to be a dissolution of things. So the created order as it was established is going to crack up. So this human activity, we can see, is having a larger cosmic effect, a larger effect on the entire created order. And I mean, literally, the order is breaking down in the world as the order breaks down in human beings. So Noah begins to assemble this ark, and God tells him to cover it inside and out, pitch. And the word, it's interesting here, the word for the covering is kabod. It's the same word that's used for the ark. The top of the ark is called the place of the covering, the kabod. And so there is something significant here in the imagery of the ark as the place of covering, the place of God's covering, God's protection. That will be reiterated again later on. We'll see that in the Ark of the Covenant. But not just then. Of course, you'll see the same thing when God covers Moses with his hand. You'll see that same word, that same symbolic gesture. So Noah goes into the ark, and for 40 days and for 40 nights, the boundaries of the created world dissolve. The order is upended and destroyed, and the world is flooded. Now, before I mentioned that we were going to see the shape of the story of Genesis 1 and 2 repeated with various different nuances or wrinkles and dimensions added here and there, but the same basic shape of things repeated. And Genesis 2 is a recapitulation on the level of the human of Genesis 1. And Genesis 8, the story of Noah, is a recapitulation then of Genesis 1. So God caused a wind to pass over the earth. It says in Genesis 8:1, this is the beginning of the beginning of the end of the flood. So the boundaries have broken down, the world is flooded, and then at the beginning of Genesis 8, God caused the wind to pass over the earth. And if you look back, you have the Spirit hovering over the abyss, over the chaos at the beginning of the world. If you look forward, where does your mind go? And God causes a great wind to blow across the water.
Tomorrow.
And it's going to be at the Exodus.
Oh, I was thinking Pentecost.
Pentecost, yeah, but particularly over water. Particularly over water here. So God caused, so we see back to the beginning, to the creation, and forward to the Exodus, at least. And that's day 1. Day 2, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained, it says in Genesis 8. And we see again, as in the second day, the separation of the deep waters from the firmament. So we see the order being restored. So man's sin caused the taxis, the order, to break down. And now, at the end of that period, when all of created the land-bound things have been destroyed on account of man, we see the order beginning to be restored by God. And it's particularly, sometimes people ask, well, what about the fish in the seas and the things that swim? The problem is really rooted in land-based life forms. Not only does God see the wickedness of the world and of human beings, but there is in Genesis, in chapters 6, and then in chapter 6, and also in the Enochic tradition, this tradition that the sons of God, which in the Enochic tradition are angels, look upon the women of the world, and they say, those are pretty, I like that. And they come down and they mate with human women, and they teach them all manner of knowledge. They teach them in the Genesis tradition, the Noahic tradition. You get things like music making, metallurgy, things like that. In the Enochic tradition, you get those things and some other things like the mixing of herbs, witchcraft, and other kinds of arts that have oscillated between kinds of natural remedy sort of approach to life and pure witchcraft, that kind of thing, magic. But the angels gave them this knowledge. So here again we see the application of illicit or untimely knowledge then turned toward evil ends. So we're repeating here with Noah Genesis 1 and Genesis 8. We're repeating the same shape of things. Day 3, the ark rests on the 17th day of the 7th month, and the mountaintops become visible on the first day of the 10th month. And you compare this to the separation of the lands and the seas on the third day. And it goes on in this way. At the end of that period, after a cycle of 7 days, and then 7 days, and 7 days, the ark comes to rest on a mountain. So God's covering, God's kabod, has brought them to a mountaintop. And they get out of the ark, and there Noah builds an altar and worships God. So here again you see, you're going right back to Genesis 1 in the worship of God in his mountaintop temple. And the world now has been recreated. So we have done Genesis all over again. And now we're back at the beginning, sort of. But there's a wrinkle. So Noah worships God on the 7th day, the Sabbath day, the day when Adam was supposed to worship God, but having fallen, he's hiding from God instead because he is naked. So the earth is recreated, and Noah does assume his priestly role and offers God sacrifice there on the mountain. But the curse that we saw at the beginning is still in effect. And now we see that emphasized in a particular way. God gives Noah dominion over the whole earth and over the animals. And he says, and every animal is now for you for food. You can eat them. But they're going to now be afraid of you. And they're going to flee from you. And it's not going to be easy for you to rule over them. Going back to the image of the thorns and the difficulty of bringing food out of the ground and the difficulty in childbirth, we see now animals and humans are divided. And so the curse is also renewed in a particular way. Hardship and the fear of death are now introduced to the animal world, as they had been introduced to man. Here again, after Noah, it says Noah becomes a farmer and he keeps vines and he makes wine. And then Noah becomes drunk on his wine and he is asleep naked in his tent on the mountaintop. So here we have this interesting thing with clothing and nakedness. And his youngest son, Canaan, comes in and sees his nakedness and goes out and tells his brothers. And his brothers come in backward, facing away from him with a covering. And they clothe their father to cover his nakedness, as God clothed Adam to hide his nakedness and to cover his shame in the garden. So we see even this action again repeated. But Canaan, the one who looked upon his father's nakedness and called attention to it, receives a curse. And Noah curses him that he will be the servant of his brothers Shem and Japheth. Canaan, also known as Ham. So we see the story, the shape of Genesis 1, and Genesis 2, and Genesis 3 played out again here. Canaan, it's important to keep him in mind because this curse is going to come up again later. And we'll see these things play out as the chapters roll on. Moving on past the flood and the restoration of creation, Noah, assuming the priesthood, Noah receiving the promises of God, that God would not again destroy the world. Now notice here that the Noahic covenant is not conditional. The Noahic covenant is purely God promising, I will not do this again. The later covenants, particularly the later Abrahamic covenants, there will be an if-then, a reciprocal covenantal relationship that's established. And the promises there will be more personal and significant. The Noahic covenant, the promise is unilateral and one-sided, but very, very general. I'm just not going to flood the earth again. And here's my rainbow as an expression of the fact that I'm not going to do this. So,
it's flooding out there.
Boy, it's raining here. Pretty hard, actually. Moving on a little bit, a couple of chapters over. So this is how I illustrate that, by turning the pages. Very clever. We get to Terah and the genealogy of Abram. In chapter 12 it says, Now the Lord said to Abram, Get out of your country, from your kindred, and from your father's house. God is calling, some length of time has passed now, and the people have dispersed. I forgot to mention. I've got to go back. In chapter 11, the previous chapter, it says that all humanity still spoke one language. So in chapter 8, we saw the restoration of creation, the recapitulation of the Genesis story, along with the curse, the division of humans and animals. Then we get to chapter 11, we see it says that all humans spoke one language and they lived in one place. And they come together to build themselves a ziggurat, a tower to heaven, that they can ascend to command God to come down, or ascend and climb up to heaven so that they can force God to do their bidding, or pull him down and sit on his throne themselves, which again is a recapitulation of the enticement from Genesis to when the snake says, you can take God's divine life for yourself. Eat this fruit, you'll live forever. So they attempt again to take God's divine life for themselves, to take God's power. And then God curses the languages, confuses the languages, and divides them up. So now we see a further fracturing of the world in the wake of the fall out of paradise. There was the fracturing of humans and animals, even in the renewed creation. And now there's the fracturing of human from human into different tongues and different languages. And they move off then to different places. And Abram's family is one of those families that moves out to Ur of the Chaldees, which is a part of the Fertile Crescent. They're near Iraq. Not too terribly far from where anybody was before, but when you're walking everywhere, it's a long way. So God calls Abram out of the land of his fathers. And so here we see God calling from the land of the earthly fathers. God calls him out of that to a land that he will give him, which echoes again that God establishes his own land, his own temple, his own place, which is not somebody else's. He says, come out of the land of your fathers to a land that I will show you. And he establishes a covenant with Abram. And he promises to make Abram the father of a great nation. And he promises his seed will inhabit the land of Canaan. Canaan, who was cursed to be the servant of the other brothers because he saw his father's nakedness and did not protect his father's priesthood in the mountaintop garden, echoing again what happens before, right? So all of this is reiterating. And I know you get the point. I just want to show you how often they go back over it again. How foundational it is to the structure of all of this. So Abram, it says that Abram obeys God and he leaves Ur of the Chaldees where his fathers were. And he comes out of there and he journeys into the land of Canaan as far as Shechem to the oak of Moreh. And there he sets up his tent on the mountain east of Bethel, which is, Bethel is the gate of God. And east, it says that Eden was in a garden on a mountain to the east. So the east is very significant. He sets up his tent to the east of the gate of God, Bethel, where Jacob will, in some years to come, lay down after having fled, having taken the birthright, and we'll see the angels ascending and descending, and say, "This is the gate of heaven. This is the dwelling place of God." So he sets up his tent there, and he builds an altar, and he worships God there, on a mountain to the east, gesturing again toward paradise. And again, it's an echo of that. You're getting these echoes. It's not paradise, but it is looking toward it, hearkening back to it, echoing it. It is intended to be that thing, or as like as it can be. And he worships God there, and God again renews the promise that he made, that he will make him the father of a great nation in years to come. And at this point, he doesn't ask anything of Abram yet. He just says, I will make it. But now, at this point, the land does not bear fruit for Abram and for Lot and that whole clan of people. Unlike paradise, where the fruit grows on the trees and man does not have to till the ground for his food, there is a famine in the land. This land does not at this time bear fruit for him. It is not for him paradise. Not now. And so he leaves there. The curse is still in effect. He leaves that place. And he goes on and he goes down to Egypt. So he's in exile from the place that God promises. And there in Egypt, Abram looks at his wife and goes, you know, you are just something else. You are a really beautiful lady, and when we get near the king of Egypt, they're going to say, look how beautiful his wife is. Let's kill that old goat and have her for my own harem. And it says, so I tell you what, you say that we are brother and sister. And Sarah gives him a sideways look. But she goes along with it, because she doesn't want them to kill Abram either. So they go down to Egypt, and sure enough, Pharaoh's people see that Sarai is a beautiful woman, and Abram says, oh yeah, she's great, she's my sister. And Sarah goes, sister. And so Pharaoh takes her into his house, but then God, it says, afflicts Pharaoh's whole household with plagues. Terrible things start happening. And he comes to Abram and he goes, what have you done? You have lied to me. You have told me a story that is not true, and you have brought ruin on my household. Take your wife and get out. Now that ought to sound familiar to you if you have ever read the story of the Exodus at all. The story of plagues, of punishment and exile. But notice here again also that they have to leave the place of the promise, and when they do, Abram's helper is taken from him. His Levite, his assistant, is taken from him. And he is in exile. But just as God cursed the snake for deceiving Eve, so God punishes Pharaoh for taking Sarah. And they are restored to each other, and they leave the place of exile. Any questions so far? Any questions out there? Well, you'll let me know, I suppose. Nope. I don't see any questions. So you don't have any questions. Good. All right. Continuing on. Moving over another little bit. Abram and Lot have their whole clan has now moved back out of Egypt up toward Canaan. And it says they're too numerous and their sheep are too many for them all to be in the same place. There's not enough grazing land, and so they agree to split up. And it says at this time that Lot moves close to the city-states of Sodom and Gomorrah. And each of these little cities is like its own little kingdom with its own king and its own customs and whatnot. Mesopotamian religion. And it says that Sodom particularly was known for its great wickedness at this time. Well, a big war breaks out between a number of these city-states, and Sodom and Gomorrah and others join forces against this oppressing king from off. And in the process, Lot and his family are taken captive and whisked away. Well, Abram hears about this, that they have been taken captive by this foreign Akkadian king, and that all their possessions and all their servants and his whole family, Lot, his brother, or the son of his brother, have been taken away into exile. They have been, and heaven only knows what's happening. So Abram calls together all of his servants, all the men, 318 of them, and he says, get out your weapons, we're going to get them. Abram goes out, and he rides hard after them, and they find them, and they make war, and Abram is victorious. He his servants, and he conquer the enemies. They kill them, and they save Lot and his whole family. And all of them are saved, and they don't lose their possessions. They keep their possessions, and he gets them all, and he brings them back with himself. And on his way back, he comes back by the cities that had been defeated, the city of Sodom and Gomorrah and these other places. And of course, he has, in addition to his own family and all of their goods, quite a lot of booty, of pillage. And he gives it all back to everything that belongs to the king of Sodom and to the others. He gives it all back. Don't ever say that I got rich on your account. He gives all of that back. He keeps nothing that is not his. And he is greeted by the king of Salem, the city of peace, by Melchizedek, who it says is the high priest of the Most High God. And this high priest comes out to bless Abram with an offering of bread and wine, symbols of thanksgiving for his victory and having redeemed his people from their oppressors, from the ones who took them and would have made them slaves or killed them off. So here again, we see, looking forward, what will become the story of the Exodus. And looking further forward, we see Christ and the harrowing of Hades. That he goes after his own. And all of his own he brings out, losing not a one of them. And you think of that prayer that he prays before his death. I haven't lost any of those that you gave to me. Directly hearkening back to Abram and Lot. I have kept them all. And he is blessed by Melchizedek with bread and wine, the symbols of thanksgiving for his victory. And God renews then the covenant with Abram and prophesies the captivity in and exodus from Egypt that will take place many generations hence. So at this point, God promises that he will give Abram a son. Now, God's been promising him all along for some years now that he's going to make him the father of a great nation. And I guess at this point, Abram has either finally gotten frustrated with the lack of detail or finally gotten up his courage and decides to say something about this. He says, Lord, my wife is barren. She has no children. I have no, my chief servant is my heir. And he's not even related to me. And God says, I will give you a son of your own body. I will give you a son of your own body. At last, here is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. Which is what Adam says when his helper is given to him. So God renews the covenant and emphasizes that he will give him an heir of his own, that he will overcome the barrenness of the wife. Again, echoing both the promise and the curse. Difficulty in childbearing, much pain, which can be both physical and, in this sense, psychological. The inability to have children. How will this happen? I don't know. This causes Abram quite a lot of angst, and Sarah not a little confusion. So God promises and renews the covenant and prophesies this coming exile, and then disappears from the scene for a little bit. And here things get interesting. And we're going to see Genesis 3 all over again. Sarah has been thinking. She has been thinking a lot about what God promised to Abram. And she is barren. So she convinces herself that somehow or another we've got to figure out how to make this promise work. Like how do we work this out? We've got to make this thing happen. So she says to Abram, I'm barren, I can't have children. God promised you seed of your own body. So here's my maidservant Hagar. She can have kids probably. So go in and lie with her, and we will fulfill God's promise this way. So we're right back at the story, the dialogue between the serpent and Eve. You can make this happen. You don't need to wait for God to do it. God just said that because he's jealous. You can have this divine life and you can be just like him now. Just take it. And we see that echoed again in Babel. Just take it. Take it and make it happen yourself. Adam listened to Eve and took the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, thinking that in doing so he could take God's own divine life. Abram listens to Sarah, fails in his priestly duty to obey God and to wait for God, to allow God to give him the gift in his own time, and does as as Sarah suggests. He goes in and he copulates with Hagar, Sarah's maid servant, and she brings forth a child, Ishmael, which is the cause of no end of trouble, because Sarah becomes incredibly jealous that now Hagar has this baby and she doesn't have a baby, and it's not her baby. This is not working out the way that she imagined that it would. I have a feeling that Eve probably felt the same way. This is not working out how I thought it would. So she begins to treat Hagar and Ishmael cruelly, to the point that they flee. And they flee, and they're off in the desert under the broom tree, with no prospect of anything but dehydration, starvation, and death in front of them. And an angel of the Lord appears and blesses Hagar and Ishmael and promises that they will be also a great nation. But Ishmael will be against every man, and there will be hostility there in future generations. But to go home and humble herself, and God will protect them. So here we see, again, a sort of a subsidiary renewing of promise and blessing, but also a renewing of the curses, of division, hostility, difficulty, animosity, that are continually echoing sort of seismically outside in the wake of what happens in the garden. Covenant is renewed in diminished ways. Priesthood and sacrifice continue to be offered. But there is now evil in the world, evil at work. And there's this continual push and pull between them, and this continual dynamic at play, in which God's covenant is offered, and things continue to break down. So, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. We're going to see in the coming chapters the birth of the child of the promise, which will not come about in the way that Sarah expected. So we'll see again yet God's faithfulness to his promise, his faithfulness to Abraham, his faithfulness to his covenant, and a renewing of that, and the introduction of the conditional if-thens, and then the renewing of the priestly role, along with some clarifications that are going to take place in exactly what that looks like and what that does not look like, in contradistinction from the world around them. And then we're going to see some of the things that are presaged here begin to fall into place. But notice the priestly, redemptive, intercessory, and protective roles that are in place here in these figures of Noah and Abraham, and the way the shape of Eden and creation continues to repeat itself and play out over and over again. Are there any questions, comments?
I have a question. All these events that are narrated here, they're all, I mean, we go back to the very beginning where God tells Abram, go out to the land that I'm going to show you. So they're still like on the way there. Is that right? They haven't reached this destination. Is that true?
Well, God promises them Canaan, the land of Canaan, but we tend to think of these words in terms of geography. But you wouldn't have to go back very far, at least in the part of the world I'm from, where you've got, old man Cletus's valley, where place names are really about the name of the family that inhabits the land, the people you would meet when you wandered through a particular part of the world. So he promises in the land of Canaan, echoing again the Noahic curses. But he doesn't say when that will come to be. And again, this is like, it's almost like a mirror image of what happens in the garden when God gives a command not to do, which is time conditioned, but God doesn't say for how long. We see that a lot in the church, actually, or in the scriptures. God gives a command, and there's a time attached to it, but it's not entirely specific. Go to Jerusalem and wait, and not many days from now, you will be clothed with power from on high. So they just have to go and wait. And the interesting thing about that, and I mentioned that specifically because that's the season we're in, the interesting thing is that this time they actually do it. They just go and they just wait. And they don't try to make it happen. They don't try to take it. So here you see a definitive break with the pattern established throughout the Old Testament. In the pattern we see in Acts, where they actually just go and wait for God to do the thing God said he was going to do. So God identifies the land of the people of Canaan, but he doesn't say when. And it's clear that it's not then, because the land doesn't produce fruit. It says there's a great famine, and so he has to leave that place. So the promise is not for that moment. He just says, go out, and I will show you the land. But he doesn't give it to him then, which again is like that commandment. Don't eat, understood to mean don't eat now. You can't take that. So it's very much a similar kind of command. The time frame is unspecified. The obedience is expected. But God is sort of laying the building blocks here for the shape of something yet to come. And since we know from Irenaeus and Origen and others that all Scripture is read retrospectively from the vantage point of Christ. In other words, Christ is the exegetical key to all of Scripture, and everything is read from that light. We see that what God is after here is not so much pedagogy for Abraham as sowing the seeds of the Word, to use Justin Martyr's expression, that will help us to see what exactly it is that it means for Christ to be about his saving work. What we're saved from. And how his salvation works. And we see, again, so from that vantage point, so if we want to step out of the way of approaching it that I've been doing it for this whole class, which is to embed us in the beginning and to move forward. If we want to step out of that and come to the present and look backward from the vantage point of what Christ has done, and to read that way, we see how God is laying down events in such a way as to reveal what the saving work of Christ looks like and what it means. That he has, when we have been taken captive by the evil king, and we are now carried off as slaves, that he comes after us and he loses not a one. And that he is blessed by the King of peace, the King of glory, and that the thanksgiving offering is offered in celebration of this victory over death and slavery. So we see how he's laying all of those pieces here so that we can begin to make sense of the work of Christ through the images and stories that are laid down. Because that's how we understand. It's much easier to understand through the pictures that we get from a story and the evocations that it makes than in purely propositional or didactic terms. Right? This gives it flesh. This gives theology flesh and image and helps us to make sense of it. So on that level, that's what God is doing here. Did that answer your question at all? I'm sorry. I didn't do a very good job.
No, my question was pretty simple. I just want to know if they got there yet.
No, they haven't got there yet.
Okay.
Or they got there, but there isn't there.
Okay. They're still on the way.
They're still on the way.
That's my question. Are we here yet?
No.
Yeah.
Man, I am not very good at answering questions. So, any other questions, comments? Insights? I'll take that as a no and say that we are then finished for the day. So next time we'll come back and we'll do Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And then we'll probably, as they say in Monty Python, skip on a bit, brother, and probably move into the Levitical books and do a little bit of pause a little bit on the liturgical worship of Israel before we get back into the fun stuff with the judges and the kings and all the killing. All right. God bless you all. Bye-bye.